I have made videos about critically endangered species, but what does critically endangered mean? What do conservation statuses mean? We'll go over that as well as many other things you should know.
A conservation status is how much a species or subspecies is at risk of extinction.
For example,
the tiger is endangered, but the subspecies Malayan tiger is critically endangered, and the Javan tiger extinct.
Now, some species are debated whether they're species, subspecies, or even just a morph. So the conservation status of this species could mean this conservation status of a subspecies of that instead. Also, sometimes a variation of a species is given a conservation status. For example, tigers with white fur are considered extinct in the wild. Now let's go over the meaning of every conservation status.
Evaluated species means a species or subspecies has not been evaluated yet for a conservation status to be given. This could or could not be because of the species or subspecies itself. An example for non-evaluated species is the pineapple fish. This species has yet to be evaluated for conservation status.
Data deficient means we don't know enough about a species' wild population or populations in range to know specifically how much at risk the species is of extinction. But usually we can assume if a data deficient species is threatened or not based on information that is not precise enough for a conservation status. An example is the Arapaima. We know the Arapaima's population has dangerously declined from overfishing, but we don't know how many there are due to the fish being widely distributed yet rare.
Least concern means a species or subspecies is at no risk of extinction due to being abundant, widespread, or even resilient. Least concern is the best conservation status a species or subspecies can have. An example of least concern species is the bald eagle, abundant for an eagle and widespread from Florida to Alaska. An example of a least concern subspecies is the American black bear, widespread and resilient due to having an adaptable diet as well as being able to nurse while pregnant.
near threatened means a species or subspecies is close to being at risk of extinction or is predicted to become a risk of extinction. If humans do not take into account what near threatened species are susceptible to, these species can quickly become threatened to extinction. Examples of near threatened species and subspecies include the maned wolf. This one requires a lot of habitat, so habitat loss could become a problem. And the southwestern black rhino, slowly recovering, but could rapidly decline again if not protected from poaching.
Vulnerable means a species, subspecies, or population is at high risk of extinction, hence the name. Yes, there are many species who are at much higher risk of extinction than vulnerable species, but vulnerable species should not be ignored. An example of a vulnerable species is the American crocodile. Populations are recovering in Florida, but in Latin America, the American crocodile is threatened by habitat loss and illegal killing. An example of a vulnerable subspecies is an African lion, much protected but not enough to stop poaching and human conflict with humans.
Endangered means the species, subspecies, or population is at very high risk of extinction, hence the name. NOAA Fisheries and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service list critically endangered species as endangered. So if you can learn about a species population, not just conservation status. Examples of endangered species are the Galapagos penguin, limited to the Galapagos Islands, which now have predatory feral cats and disease-carrying dogs, and the cheetah, not given enough conservation of its habitat despite fame.
critically endangered means a species or subspecies is at extreme high risk of extinction, or in some instances, even possibly extinct or extinct in the wild. Possibly extinct or possibly extinct in the wild species and subspecies are always listed as critically endangered because if the species is extinct in the wild, the populations are likely to be tiny, therefore meaning the species is at extremely high risk of extinction. Examples of critically endangered species are the vaquita, of which there are only 10 living individuals, of which are all in the wild, and the Sardaria sturgeon. Has not been officially seen since the 1960s, but there have been unconfirmed sightings in the species in the 21st century.
Extinct in the wild means the individual or of a species doesn't exist anymore. Only in captivity or in highly protected and regulated areas. Most extinct in the wild species or subspecies are trying to be reintroduced into the wild by humans, but lack of protected habitat and species. Some examples that are extinct in the wild are such as the spix macaque. Smuggling and habitat destruction have killed every single one of the spix macaque in existence. But they were introduced to the species, and the Guam kingfisher, which would have been extinct if not in some U.S. and German zoos.
Extinct means that every living individual of a species, subspecies, or population is certainly dead. Presumably extinct means when a species or subspecies is only possibly extinct. Many news articles, even the title of this section, will call extinct in the wild and presumably extinct species extinct. But this is not always true. Yes, some thought to be extinct species have been rediscovered, but almost all extinct species can't even be hypothetically extinct. An example of an extinct species is the Chinese paddlefish. It could not access breeding areas due to the Dezhobwa Dam and died quickly afterwards from pollution and overharvest. An example of a presumably extinct species is the deepwater cisco, almost certainly extinct, but could be extremely rare instead.
Remember, a species or subspecies is not always given a fully justifiable conservation status. For example, the Florida panther is endangered, but the almost as abundant Malayan tiger is critically endangered. Even though any extant species, subspecies, and populations can be saved and recovered, but the most threatened species and subspecies need conservation and protection immediately in a great amount in order to be saved. Always have hope. As you can see, I have used many sources, but I mainly used DataZone and the IUCN Red List for the definition of conservation statuses.
Please like, subscribe,